Hello, welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega, Mitch J., David Joseph, Trick Slattery, and Michael Walsh. Did I mention everybody? Anyway, there's 7 of us today, I think, and this is our 100th episode. And so this is kind of major because we can talk about our goals and our priorities and motives for doing this podcast, why the free will topic is the biggest thing ever. And it's big because it touches every other issue of moral, political, religious, ethical, philosophical importance in every area of all life on the planet. So we were talking about, for example, animal cruelty. And I remember George saying, we deny that certain things are bad or immoral because, then we would have to realize, well, we've been doing something immoral. And if we believe that we freely chose that bad action and that it was up to us, we will blame ourselves. And that's not a good feeling. The emotions behind that makes us feel so bad that it causes people to deny reality, which I'm sure Mitch J would agree is not good. He's all about reality and logic and rationality and reason, all that.
You know me too well.
Yes, I've heard you. I have heard you and George go at it on all kinds of disagreements on interesting things. And so I think all of us need to share what we think the ultimate top priority, more than anything else, is.
Well, guys, let me start, all right? Because I ordinarily quote John Searle, amazing quote. I mean, I used it for the first 100 episodes of my TV show, and he says, like, for our world to acknowledge the free will is an illusion would be, I quote, a bigger revolution in our thinking than Einstein or Copernicus or Galileo or Newton or Darwin. Then he says it would alter our whole conception of our relation to the universe. I truly believe that it's the biggest thing in that sense. But having said that, I mean, why are we doing this podcast? We're doing this podcast because, like, this delusion of free will is so harmful to us. And how does it harm us? It harms us by limiting our happiness. In other words, like, I have to, like, even though, like, this is, like, the biggest thing ever per se, basically what I'm trying to say is, like, the holy grail, the biggest thing that will ever be, I think, is happiness. In other words, like, if somebody invented a happy pill where all of a sudden everybody's happy, 24/7, I would guess crime would go down to zero and the world would be blissful. But, until that happens, I think that overcoming free will belief is probably the one thing we could do to create a much happier world.
Yes, it will help us make a happier world, which is part of why it's so important. So I guess it's about, we each have priorities and things we want that lead to better happiness, and the whole pleasure and pain hedonic imperative is what it is all about fundamentally. And so I would say this is the most important topic because of how it relates to our desires and our need to be happy, perhaps.
Yes, okay, so George, Chandler, you guys have brought out happiness, so I completely agree with all of that. But just to give another fundamental idea that's really important to me, what kind of motivates me, I'm really interested in honesty. Not just intellectual honesty, but honesty itself. I think people people face problems. There are real problems that we have to face, whether it's an asteroid that's about to hit us or an illness that your child could potentially die from. And the way to solve problems is through honesty, because only through honesty can you assess the problem correctly and then devise effective solutions. So we need to be, as a people, reasonable people who value logic and evidence and talk about issues honestly. And I think if we move in that direction, one natural conclusion that you come to is that free will is nonsense. And this reality we exist in is a deterministic one.
Right. And so, Mitch, I imagine you would agree that it's not good to lie to ourselves or other people, even if that brings us some happiness.
So could you say that again, actually?
Yeah. So since being honest is important, it's good to be living in the truth and reality. So even though we want to be happy, our happiness, needs to come about truthfully and
Yes,
not
exactly.
honestly.
Absolutely. Because if not, then we will just succumb to all the threats that are looming. You cannot solve problems without honesty. That is the key idea.
Right, and I agree with Mitch on this. I think rationality kind of precedes this whole topic. We need to become rational people before anything else, because that's what leads to conclusions like there's no free will, and actually um, the whole thing of knowing the logical case for something or the rational case for something means that we have more correct information rather than misinformation, and that tends to cause better consequences in the long run for everybody.
Yeah, it really does lead to a better outcome once everybody is being reasonable. They are in the truth. So I think that we all have slightly different variations on the same thing, but that it all fits together.
Yeah. To put it another way, if everybody all of a sudden came to the conclusion that there was no free will, but they did it in a non-rational way, and they did it in a way that they sided with what's called fatalism,
Oh yeah.
that would be a problematic. It would cause a lot more problems in the world because it's not a rational account. It doesn't account for the actual facts of how, our thoughts and actions are causally part of the uh, output, and rather it would cause what's called defeatism. People would just be, oh, things just happen the way they happen, and they wouldn't bother to care about anything. So that account of no free will, I'd be against. So it's the fact that it's a rational account of free will that I think is a little more important than just free will itself, no free will itself.
I
Yeah,
You know what
agree.
I mean by that?
I think the illogic behind fatalism is that it presupposes that we can know the future. In other words, like, the fact is we can't know what's going to happen, let's say, when we take the test. So, like, so wisdom says that we better study and not leave it up to chance.
Right, and fatalism kind of disconnects us from the causes. So basically, when someone's a fatalist, they think that things are um, predestined to happen, regardless of what they do. Uh, they're not taking into account that what they do is part of the process that leads to what happens, but rather things are going to happen no matter what they do. So if someone doesn't call a doctor, or they do call a doctor, it doesn't matter to the outcome of whether they're going to be cured for that disease. That's what's fated. So that's kind of problematic. So it's this idea of no free will that I find very problematic. It doesn't align with what reality or rationality actually say about why we don't have free will.
Yeah, Trick, that's why you put so much work into that blog post and that infographic about the difference between determinism and fatalism. And I did see your conversation with that compatibilist who commented on there, and he thinks that the no free will message will lead to defeatism, and it seems like he's misunderstanding the fatalism versus determinism difference. And I think you're right. If everyone became fatalist, that would be even worse.
Yeah, and I think a lot of compatibilists, that's what they do. They automatically think that the no free will position is fatalistic. So they say we can't tell people about the no free will position because it'll lead them to fatalism. But that's why we have to educate people on what really the no free will position is about. And so it's
Well,
not just telling people that they don't have free will. It's saying this is why we don't have free will. This is what it means that we don't have free will. So we have to that's all important to this whole free will topic.
that's a very good point, though, because the layperson, upon understanding non-free will, the initial gut reaction is fatalism. I mean, whenever I talk to people about free will and non-free will, their initial reaction is like, "Oh, if there's no free will, then basically, why should I even get up tomorrow and make breakfast?"
Yeah, it's based on a misunderstanding. It's based on their psychology. That's kind of a free will psychology that they have. So it's based on all these things that we have to educate them out of, basically. So
The other huge misconception is that, like, the no free will perspective is analogous to anarchy. That, like, if everybody understands that nothing is really up to us, then everybody will say, well, fine, I can do whatever I want, and you can't blame me. So, like, people are afraid that civilization is going to collapse.
Yeah, well, we can't blame them, but we can still try to stop them.
right, they some people, some compatibilists will even go so far as to say, oh, we just have to let all the criminals go loose. If there's no free will, just let them all go loose because it's not their fault. But that's a mistaken thinking of this topic. So they weren't educated on why people are, in
A
prison.
source of optimism for free will advocates who start feeling fatalistic once they investigate determinism is well, like one way, for example, that I look at the universe is like this. Due to the deterministic nature of reality, due to the fact that we're constantly bombarded by different influences, there's unlimited potential for what you can become. And as George mentioned earlier, determinism is not predestination or all these ridiculous words. There is no entity, there is no Laplace's demon, there is no entity that knows what is going to happen. Therefore, you can be optimistic knowing that if the right set of influences affect you, you can become something very different than you ever imagined. This is why we have reformed criminals. This is why we have people who used to weigh a lot and then they lose a lot of weight. Life can go in any direction.
Mitch J., you just explained the freedom that you find in determinism. The fact that we people can, through the process of trial and error, find the different causes that compel the desirable behavior that we want. That's
sometimes.
What?
Sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes. And once again, some of us have lucked out, and we had recently talked about intelligence, and how some people are intelligent enough to get concepts and certain aren't, and yet there is a potential for humanity and the world as a whole to change and adapt to be better, even though it is true that for some individuals that never happens.
Yeah, I want to go into that briefly. Basically, I think we have a problem in our world that our leaders, our top academics, a lot of times are not very intelligent. And I think there's various ways people succeed. One is through kind of like emotional, social intelligence, where they know people, they know how to schmooze, they're very political, and they ascend to positions of power in that way. Another way is I think people have strong memories and they're good at learning and retaining, but they're clueless in terms of understanding what they've learned. So one way this free will issue is so important to the world is it provides a very powerful, very clear, and very simple logical intelligence test. I mean, if our leaders are advocating for free will, that'll tell you right off the bat either that they're immoral, that they understand that we don't have a free will and they're lying to the public, or they're just not, in my opinion, logically intelligent enough to lead. So like again, we have a huge problem with climate change and all this. So to the extent that we can weed out the pseudo-intellectuals, the pseudo-intelligent among our leaders especially, that would be a huge benefit to the world.
Yeah, to be quite blunt, our leaders often, the people who are running things are either lying or stupid, and we can't blame them for being so, but neither of those is a good position to be in, and it's not good for us.
Or if we want to be a little more polite, and it's not that I'm not saying I disagree with you, but just to be a little more diplomatic about it, the intelligence they do have is not in the arena that we think they have. So you've seen this before, where people are very successful in one endeavor, and they think because they're good at that endeavor, they're good at others.
Like Trump.
Right.
Yeah.
So Trump's a good example. Trump's good at some things, but he certainly would not. He's not an expert on foreign affairs. He doesn't seem to be the most compassionate kind of person. He's not qualified to be a president.
Absolutely.
But he might be qualified for other things. I don't know.
Yeah, and for example, somebody might be able to play the piano, but that doesn't mean that they make a good economist or something like that.
Yeah, one of the best examples of that is Dr. Ben Carson, who's also running for president. He's pretty high up there in the polls. He's a brilliant neurosurgeon. He was like the first person ever to separate twins conjoined at the brain. And yet, when this guy opens his mouth on politics and scientific issues, he's just totally retarded. You know, he's a young Earth creationist for one thing. I think he denies also climate change, and he thinks that Obamacare is the worst thing to happen to America since slavery. I mean, and this guy was a neurosurgeon. Being brilliant in one area does not necessarily transfer to any other areas.
Yeah, people need to stay within their field.
And again, the thing is, like, yeah, people can develop skills. Like surgery is a very, precise skill, and like, a lot of knowledge. Being a scientist requires one to not to know and retain a lot of information. But again, like the point is, like that's a vastly different skill than understanding, than basically like the skill of logic. And I think logic has to be, like we were talking about it before. Logic, reason forms the basis of everything that we can hope for, that it should form the basis of at least our leaders' abilities. If they're good at socializing and memorizing and stuff, but they're not good at logic, they're just not going to be good at leading.
Let's have George Ortega for president of the United States.
No, I would. I'm good at thinking, but no, you got to be good at the other stuff too.
Yeah, I mean, look, I definitely think George has got the morals, that we desire. But you know what? I can tell you that I wouldn't want to be in politics. I'm probably the least political of the whole bunch here, actually.
I think we get what our system promotes, really. I mean, the current established social system, so to speak, kind of promotes that kind of illogical thinking all the way to the top, and that's what's rewarded, I think. And I think if George was in power, I would have a suspicion that maybe he would get slightly corrupted by all the influences that would be acting upon him, and perhaps he would start being a bit illogical sometimes as well.
I'd be a tyrant. I wouldn't allow anybody to eat meat. Period.
The same would happen if I was in charge too, guys. So that's a very important point, because
well, George Ortega, he'll be a better president than I would be. Put it that way.
well, Jamie, I just want to say I would rather you be a president than any of the people who are actually running and who are voted in that I know about in America anyway. Of course, you're in the UK, a whole another thing, but
yeah, but if I was president, I wouldn't know what to do exactly, because I wouldn't know what laws to instate or what laws to take away, except for this, like, marijuana problem. I mean, it's definitely a problem in it where people get locked up for possession of marijuana and stuff.
Yeah.
But as Trick was saying earlier, George, it's about rationality, right? You don't want to dogmatically force people into not eating meat. You want to reveal your feelings about veganism and animal cruelty and just pain and suffering on living things in general, right?
Well,
and hope that
Mitch,
leads to a lifestyle change.
Mitch, I'm kind of like more for like, because like this free will issue has demonstrated to me how unintelligent people are. And the animal issue, carnism and all that, has demonstrated to me how cruel we are. So like, I don't think, because, I'm a consequentialist. So like, I would kind of like, I wouldn't have a problem with a quote unquote benevolent despot, a despot who says, like, this is the way things are, that benefits everybody, that like, let's say, alleviates suffering and all that, and kind of like de-democratizes this place. Because again, I would rather see a happy world led by somebody who says, well, this is what happens because I say it is, than like a miserable world that like, well, we're all agreeing to just like make the wrong decision. So I know it's not democratic, but my main concern is alleviating suffering. I don't know.
Yeah, and I understand how you feel, George. In fact, there was a question one of my friends on Facebook wrote. It was one of those red button or blue button questions. Like, the blue button is for everything to be democratic and whatever the majority wants goes, and the red button was for a dictator that had identical political views as you to take control. And I did comment the red button because I do sort of feel that way,
I would just like to point out that I strongly disagree with the dystopic nightmare that George is describing. Okay?
Well, to be fair, George did say that he was talking about something where he kind of knows that the outcome would be, everybody would be happy. I think that it wouldn't be the case for that. That the consequences, because I'm a consequentialist as well, George, that the consequences of such is better that everybody has a say, because that is actually what leads to the better consequence when we educate people and the rational. If everybody was rational, that would lead to, I think, a better consequence than a dictator that dictated
Well,
happiness.
definitely, absolutely.
But yeah, theoretically, if there was some dictator that, and we could know that dictator would make everybody happy, regardless if it was a rational way or not, then yeah, that would be better.
Yeah, they would have to have the highest intelligence and the highest morality, the highest compassion in order for it to succeed, because one or the other
Yeah,
isn't enough.
it's just not. Yeah, it's just not probable that something like that could possibly happen. So like, putting a thing on one person to run everybody, um, means that person has to be flawless. So, and there's no way for that to ever happen. So
Right. So getting back to increasing, let's say, the intellectual power of the masses, of all of us, I can't think of a better way to do this than through this free will issue, because like so much like evolution, climate change, all this stuff, it requires advanced knowledge to come up with the right answers. I mean, a lot of times we have to just take it on faith that our scientists, know what they're talking about. But like with this free will issue, as we were saying yesterday, a second grader can understand the reasoning behind this. So this is a powerful tool for teaching our world how to think.
So, George, can you remind us how you came to the conclusion that there is no free will?
Probably I just like said to myself, well, there's ways I want to be. I might want to be more confident. I might want to read faster, whatever. And I realized, wait a minute, I'm not doing it. I want to and I can't. So obviously I said, wait a minute, it's not up to me. Then I just extended it to everyone else.
So there was no special books or studies or anything like that you read that convinced you, or?
I think I came to this intuition, I think, earlier than that, whatever. I mean, people, it's a logical question. In other words, like, for example, if you're discussing causality, if everything has a cause, because a lot of times, like this is in physics, quantum mechanics and all that, then, it's pretty basic logic that if everything has a cause, then free will is impossible. I mean, so like, yeah, that's the thing. So like, a person can understand this issue completely by reading 2 pages. A person doesn't even have to read a book for this.
Yeah, and I think it was just George's experiences in his life that led him to see that he didn't have the free will to be able to choose to be and do what he wanted. And so I think perhaps it could have happened like any of us, that could happen for us. However, it is just very helpful that those of us who do come about this through our life experiences to share this information, because that saves other people, the next generation, trouble. They don't have to go through that longer process of figuring it out.
Excellent point.
Yeah. And see, the things will never be the same, because now that we do have the internet, and now that we have this podcast, and there's all these books about the whole free will topic, it will, I think, start a movement. I don't know what the movement will be called. I don't know, the new determinist movement, or what we're going to call it. But there will be, perhaps, I think everybody will get their whatever everybody wants. We all have different needs and what we want, related to happiness and logic and all this. And I think it will lead to that. I think that an understanding of the causes of human behavior will ultimately lead each person to do better in whatever field that they're interested in.
I think that at some point the evidence against free will just become overwhelming, just like the evidence for evolution, and no educated, rational person will be able to deny it anymore at some point. That doesn't mean that there won't be people who do it. I mean, just like with evolution, I mean, millions of people still deny it, even though they have access to all the evidence on the internet and books and documentaries and stuff. There'll still be a lot of people who deny it, but for most people at some point, I think the paradigm will change when the evidence just becomes overwhelming and impossible to ignore.
Well,
Yeah.
but Michael, I agree with you, except like isn't the evidence already there? In other words, like, we don't have to rely on empirical evidence, on the neuroscience, on Libet. You know, all we have to understand is like causality makes free will impossible, and acausality makes free will impossible. So I'm thinking that, like, you know, it's more a matter of people, you know, being
Well,
compelled to.
the problem with that though is that not everybody, from a philosophical perspective, has the same views on causality. You know, for religious people, they think that the soul or the mind or whatever they would call it is the first cause initiator of a freely willed decision. And so metaphysically, they have a different view on causality than you do. So I would say that the science from physics and from neuroscience definitely has to be a factor into overcoming that, to show that that view is simply wrong.
I could, but Michael, I mean, we could like, let's say, like, you know, we have a soul that's the first whatever, but we can even argue that if we didn't create ourselves, we were created by whatever, then how are we, you know, in other words, like, we're created in a certain way that compels us to decide in a certain way. So even like with the soul, I think there's a logical argument against the free will there also.
Yeah,
Well,
causality wouldn't be any. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mike.
No, I was just going to say that I agree that there's two lines of evidence against free will. One is from science, from physics and neuroscience. The other is purely philosophical. But the
Logical, I would
philosophic,
say, actually.
it's
Yeah.
well, yeah, well, logical, philosophical. Logic is part of philosophy, so but I'm using the big container of philosophy to encompass logic. So line of argumentation is philosophical, but you have to use that to undermine people's sense of causality that may not be in tune with the philosophical argument against free will. They may have a notion of causality that is different, and you need to philosophically refute that.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, but I do think that the evidence against free will is already there. Because, I mean, but it's interesting because I just think what it is people ignore that evidence. I don't think that there's any lack of information available. I just think that people want to feel that they're in control and they like to be able to blame people and punish them for their emotional reasons. And that's why it's better not to, for them, they don't want to look at the cause of human behavior. It's
Yeah.
very much that's I think
I agree, Chandler. I think there's two issues. The first issue is education, getting people to understand what is being said and what are the consequences. Then those who are on board for that, the next part is getting them to overcome their personal biases and getting them to let go of that urge they might have, those retributive urges or anything like that. So yeah, so there's two elements to the game right there.
Yeah, the problem
Well,
is even people that have a rational account of other things, like even atheists who rationally
Yep.
understand that God doesn't exist or the lack of they lack a belief in God. They come to this through rational reasons or any other rational. They can be purely rational in every other
Yep.
instance, but when it comes to this free will thing, they'll still have a problem with it. They can't wrap their minds around it. So this is something we have to kind of overcome.
I
That's our
just had
challenge.
that problem actually just the other day when I was talking to a guy when I was at an atheist meetup. He still believes in what would he would it would technically be libertarian free will, but he was trying to call it compatibilism, even though it technically was not compatibilism. So even among atheists, there is still a very large percentage of atheists who still cling to this inculcated idea of free will that they have been raised with their entire lives.
Yeah.
This is why.
The
No,
libertarian
please
notion.
continue.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Oh, the
No,
libertarian notion is probably the most illogical of all the notions. Then there's compatibilism, which basically is just people redefining the term free will to what they want it to be, basically. So
compatibilism makes
that
absolutely no sense.
yeah, I know
Yeah.
it doesn't. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But basically, they in a way that kind of avoids all of the importance of what we're discussing. So they just kind of bypass all that and just redefine it, as people are able to make choices. That's pretty much it. That's Daniel Dennett for you. So
Yep.
I was just about to say Daniel Dennett. And that kind of reminds me of, is it Neil deGrasse Tyson, who claims to be an agnostic instead of saying an atheist?
He
Yeah,
does
that's
say
different,
that,
though.
but technically he's an atheist. Technically, he just
Right,
doesn't
exactly.
like the term because he's such a popularizer of science. If the term atheism was associated with him, it hurt his reputation, and he'd have less business opportunities.
yeah, and the term agnostic actually isn't problematic. Like, I'm an agnostic and I'm an atheist. I'm actually both of those. They're not mutually exclusive terms. So someone can actually be an agnostic and be an atheist. So
Well, yeah, they're
I
not.
think
Yeah,
you have to be an agnostic atheist. That's the rational way to be.
you could be a Gnostic atheist. You can basically think that God does not exist. Not lack of belief in God, but think that God does not exist in any concept of God.
Well,
That would
not a Gnostic atheist would be someone who knows God doesn't exist.
right. That's a Gnostic atheist, right? You could technically be a Gnostic atheist, but
Well, I'm saying
most,
I
most
don't
atheists
really.
aren't.
I think the rational position is to be an agnostic atheist. So yeah, whatever. Agnostic, good enough. You're one of us. That's how I put it. So-
Anyway,
I
we're off
have
topic. We're off topic. So
My bad.
I know, but I just had something quick to say about that because I think that the problem with the whole terms of agnostic and atheist or theist in relation to the God question is similar to what we're experiencing with the free will belief. How you've got libertarianism, you've got compatibilism with free will belief. I think there's a lot of redefining of God that goes on in religion debates, about, well, God is all powerful. No, God is not all powerful. Here's a different God that I believe in. And so you're wrong to say God's all powerful. All that kind of stuff. God knows the future and one religion doesn't know the future. There'll be one God or three gods or thousands of gods or no gods, So the whole thing is it's a word game. It's a semantic games about definitions. And that's why I don't play it. I'm not going to pick on anybody if they use a different term, what they
yeah,
call
it's just important that we clarify definitions when a compatibilist does come into the conversation, because then it just becomes confusing and people talk past each other because the compatibilist is using one definition, we're using a different one, and then they're just talking past each other with these different definitions, and it doesn't work. So you have to. Yeah.
Yeah, we have to defend the correct definition of free will, because if we don't, then the issue would just come so much more confusing. But we have to do even more than that. In refuting free will, we're kind of like arguing for a negative in a sense, and that's not a good messaging strategy. In other words, like the way it's traditionally framed in academia, it's like, well, do we have a free will, or it's like free will versus determinism, right? But like, you see the lack of grammatical balance between them. So like, I think we have to come up with a term, like we either have a free will or a now. What I'd like to propose, but I think some of you guys may feel that we should go with a better term, is that I would propose like a universal will, saying that like, well, what we do is up to the universe, but of course, that's kind of like attributing agency to the universe. And I know some people would prefer not to do that, but my stronger point is that we really need to come up with a positive, instead of like being a no free willer, something that expresses our position positively.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's better, I call myself a determinist rather than an a free willist or something like that.
Right, but do you understand the syntactic difficulty with that? So, like, do we have a free will, or do we, then when we get to it, like, do we have a determined will? I mean, perhaps a determined will is the answer. I don't know, but like...
Yeah, or you call it a causal will often.
Wait a second, hold on. What is the definition of free will? Are we all agreeing that the proper definition of free will is the libertarian definition of free will?
Yes.
Yeah. Basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and maybe for our listeners, we just need to clarify exactly what the libertarian free will is.
Yeah, there's a number of ways that you can encompass that libertarian free will. Like, each person probably has their own way of wording things and things like that, but they all kind of equate to almost like the same thing, pretty much. So.
Yeah, and for example, Trick Slattery has written his book, and it's very good. That you could have, of your own accord, have chosen otherwise. That definition of free will, that you could have in the past done differently than you in fact did, and it would have been up to you rather than causal or random events that were not up to you.
Yeah,
Right, and I
perhaps
think
since
that
this
is the
is
critical distinction
yeah.
on what libertarian free will is and all the other definitions of it. Is that you could have done differently in situation X if the clock were run back and run again.
So I was just gonna say, because it's the 100th episode, I mean, maybe we should do what we do routinely. Let's, talk a little bit about. Well, I mean, I don't want to get to the realm of academia for a very long time, but perhaps there's some listeners that aren't sure of the terms that we're using. I think it's never harmful to go over them a little bit, right? So we're always talking about determinism, this idea of cause and effect, that everything had an antecedent factor, and there's this infinite causal chain, this causal regression, right?
Yeah.
And then we want to talk about, do we live in a universe where we can have this and have this other thing called free will? This idea that, yes, you could have done otherwise. This idea that somehow human beings and possibly animals can somehow control their decisions somewhere, some of the time. So philosophers have debated for a long time, and sadly are still debating, whether or not it's possible to be in a universe where you have both of these things at the same time, and what the consequences of that are. So an incompatibilist would say, nah, you can't have both of those. A compatibilist says, yeah, you can have both of those, but somehow you can still have free will. And the hard determinist or the hard incompatibilist might say, free will is nonsense. No matter what kind of universe you live in, whether it's because of determinism, which is what the hard determinist says, or in any kind of universe, whether there's quantum phenomena, randomness, acausal, whatever way you want to describe it, there is no way there is room for free will.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's my position. I'm a hard incompatibilist. I don't refer
Yep.
myself as a hard determinist, only because some people try to take the indeterministic route, the libertarians, and try to apply free will to that. And I say, no, you can't do that. So
Yeah.
I'm a hard incompatibilist.
Yeah, it's this very slight semantic difference,
Yeah,
because even
exactly.
though I call myself a hard determinist, as soon as somebody brings up, indeterminism or true randomness, and I'm like, well, randomness isn't up to you. If something happens
Yeah.
for no reason, you didn't cause it. And so I usually refer them to like George or Trick and what they've written about that, because
Well, most hard determinists are hard incompatibilists. They think that randomness doesn't help. They just think that the universe actually is deterministic. That's a fact for them. So
right.
they'll just say, I'm a hard determinist.
Yeah,
Everything is causal. Whereas I'm not 100%. I'm more agnostic on that position, whether everything is causal or not. So that's why I consider myself a hard incompatibilist.
Guys, we may actually want to explore that. Maybe not necessarily on this episode, because I think it confuses people. I think that the prospect of things happening without there having been caused is something that lends a lot of people to believe that there is a possibility for free will. Now, Harris in his book, he equivocated. He kind of like didn't address that. Many people kind of like, give credence to this idea of like true randomness. And I think to the extent that we can kind of like, again, my position is like that randomness or acausality is as incoherent a concept as is free will. In other words, like the prospect of something happening without a cause kind of like suggests that the universe didn't exist before this, whatever happened. So
Yeah,
like,
but when you say something is incoherent, George, then you're actually saying that it's illogical, that you can't logically produce that. And I'm saying that there's no logical case against a causality. That doesn't mean a causality is true or anything. It's just that there's no logical case that you can make that things just don't come into existence. That
all right, I
particles
hear
or
you
that.
about the incoherence. Yeah, I know, because like sometimes we say that like free will is an incoherent concept, and I think when we say that, it's kind of like it requires the causality that refutes it and all. But yeah, I hear your point. So like so it's not that it's incoherent. It's just that like there's no evidence. There can never be evidence for it.
Correct.
And I think that it's not that it's not incoherent, but it's illogical, right? I mean, I think according to
if it's illogical, then it is incoherent. So if it's not illogical, if you can actually make a case for it being illogical, then you're making a case for it being actually incoherent. I'm saying you can't make a case for it being illogical, is what I'm saying.
Well, can we try that? Does anybody have a case for, how, like, you can't have something happening without a cause, based on logic?
Well,
there is a fundamental flaw to that logic, though. Of course. Because we would have to talk about the very beginning of things. And that would mean there's never been a beginning of anything.
Why would we have to talk about the beginning of
things? Well, if you say that everything had to have a cause, that means that everything always had to cause. So there was never an original.
Oh, right.
Ever.
So if the beginning, the very beginning of things could have been an acausal event. We don't know. Or it could have been, it could be that we're just in a long line of infinity, basically. So it's one or the other. So yeah.
And I don't think that makes or breaks our position officially on this podcast about the incoherence of free will, obviously. But I mean, I happen to think of, as determinists, I think of the infinite regress, that we have an infinity and there was no true beginning. But for the most part, people don't even have to be concerned. Our listeners who that's getting over their head, they don't need to be concerned about that. All they need to know is that you did not choose the start of your life right here and now. You did not choose where or when to who you were born, your biology, your environment. So you don't need to be concerned about the Big Bang or the beginning of the whole universe.
Yeah, and this whole notion of acausality, we can save that for a different podcast, because I'm sure we have a lot to say on that. So
yeah,
sounds all right. But do you guys want to address the? I mean, should we work toward a term that's positive, that's not a negation? Like that we're not no free willers. We are. What are we? We gotta
free willy.
I would like to say one thing about the incoherence thing. So here's a typical example that I usually use when I result to calling free will an incoherent statement, because sometimes I do describe it that way.
Well, free will is incoherent, but yeah.
I agree, right? So here's what we're saying. We're saying that we do understand what it means to say something doesn't have a cause. That is coherent. We know what we mean when we say that. We don't know if it's true, I guess. We could argue about that. But we know what that means. That means nothing made it happen. When people talk about free will, we say it's incoherent. It's like saying, what color is the number 2? That's usually, that is incoherent. That doesn't make any logical sense. It's not a property of that.
But Mitch, wait a minute. Yeah. For example, if I had a free will, right, I could coherently argue that I would be blissed out every moment of every day because every thought and feeling would be up to me. Now that makes sense.
No, that's not what I'm saying, though. I'm not talking about the result of free will. I'm saying the reason why compatibilists fail, from my perspective, the main reason is that they can't define what they're talking about. They're constantly jumping around. They have no idea what they're saying, and the reason they don't know what they're saying is because what they're saying doesn't make any sense. It's incoherent.
Well, compatibilists actually have a coherent definition. It's just that they use a totally different definition that doesn't actually address the common intuitions that people have.
Well, that's cheating, though, because that's not what we're talking
and it doesn't
about.
address the actual philosophical history that so basically they change up the definition, but the libertarian thinks that indeterminism helps free will, and then there's just people that just think free will exists and they don't really understand why. So those are the basically but it's incoherent, like a square circle is incoherent. It's logically incontradictory with the two possible ways events can come about. So
it's a very interesting thought. I mean, it's like the invisible pink unicorn in a way, because they're saying it's invisible and pink, and so you have a problem. And free will has to be neither deterministic or indeterministic, because it has to be up to the individual, meaning that individual could not have been created by prior causes. They had to create themselves, and it couldn't be due to just randomness happening for no reason, because then it's up to nothing.
Right.
But furthermore, here's it's back to the coherence thing. So here's my issue. My issue is this: free will only makes sense. The kind of free will we're talking about, the type of free will that compatibilists are running away from, it
Mhm.
only makes sense in the context of responsibility, which is another tricky word. So if what someone is describing makes responsibility meaningless, then that is not free will.
Yeah,
It's you have to, yeah,
compatibilists will have different definitions for the word responsibility as well. So that's
right,
another word that's very ambiguous. You have all these different notions of responsibility. Some of them are just kind of the deterrence type of responsibility. The other ones are you're actually the person actually deserves what they get. so
Right,
so
but I think we have to defend responsibility also. In other words, like there's a cogent, very understandable sense of responsibility that I think is the one that should apply. That the other ones are incorrect. In other words, like
I agree.
if we're yes, so like and that's what we have to defend. It's basically like if if we take a pill and that pill makes us do something immoral, we are not fundamentally responsible for what that pill made us do. So like clearly there's that sense. So just like just as they're using straw man definitions of free will, they do use these straw man definitions of responsibility also. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like how you qualified that, George, with fundamentally responsible,
yep.
because that qualifier is actually helpful in people understanding what you're talking about when you say it. So
Yeah, and I look at it as the difference between being legally responsible or morally responsible, and that they are different things.
Right,
Yeah.
practical versus fundamental responsibility.
Yeah, like instead of blaming people, we identify people as the most proximate causes of whatever happened. But like it's a identification that's not pejorative.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's so important. I mean, it's sad that we even have to do this. It's sad that we have to talk about, fundamental versus practical responsibility, and that we even have to explain the difference between the compatibilist and libertarian free wills. Because when people use these words, they don't do a distinction. Like, are you a practical or a fundamental atheist? I mean, it's time consuming and difficult, which is why so many people are scared to do it.
I guess a practical atheist would be an agnostic, right?
I guess so.
Yeah. I mean, they're at first glance they seem to behave and act exactly as you would if you were a regular atheist, but they just haven't gone all the way and said, well, no, I don't believe, or there is no God.
Right. A practical is the idea is behaving as if a certain worldview is true, you might say, because that's a very practical thing to do. Similarly, somebody might be a practical determinist because they are still acting as if everything has a cause. Because even if a causal event did happen, it would not be practical for them to apply that to their life.
So then wouldn't a compatibilist be like a practical libertarian in a way?
Oh my, what are we talking?
I think you're confused. That's getting things very confusing.
Meaning they're acting as if there's libertarian free will, even though deep down they recognize it's all,
Right.
determined.
Yeah, that makes
Interesting.
sense. Yeah. That's kind of what it is. They kind of avoid the whole libertarian notion to avoid all the topics that arise from that notion. So
Yeah, I think they have the cognitive dissonance problem because they are, on one level, knowing that determinism, or maybe even indeterminism, rules out free will, but they're still acting as if there is a free will because of their emotional need to do so. It's just like the revenge question that we were talking about in our last episode. People, they still want revenge and might seek revenge even though they know somebody doesn't deserve it.
what was this episode about again?
Well, actually, this is our 100th episode, and we were talking about why this topic is so important.
Okay.
Oh yeah, so yeah, going back to the main topic. So we started by, I mean, we were all sharing some of the main issues that motivate us, and and I think Trick mentioned rationality, and George and Chandler, you guys talked about happiness, and I talked about rationality as well, and also honesty. Mike, did you? I don't know. Did everyone else
Um,
chime in on
I
that topic?
I don't think I chimed in directly, but I would agree with a lot of what you guys already said. I mean, to me, my main I guess motivation is just the truth and logical and evidence-based reasoning, which I think would force you to a degree to accept that free will is an illusion, it's not real. And that's why epistemology is also a very important thing to me, which is, of course, the study of knowledge, how you come
Yep.
to know what you know.
Yep.
And this is a problem that I have, a big problem they have with a lot of religious people, is because a lot of times when I get into a disagreement with, like a traditional Christian, Muslim, or Jew, a lot of times I'm naively just assuming that they care about evidence and logical based reasoning
Yep.
in the same way I do, but they don't. Because to them, their epistemology includes things like revelation, or because it's written in a book, it therefore is true. Or they might presuppose that belief in God is properly basic, that it's like accepting that the external world is real. It's just a thing that you just have to accept in order to have any basis, to any starting point in any reasoning. And that's what a lot of religious people do, and a lot of people critical of religion don't realize that the whole basis of how you reason and how you come to infer ontology, what exists, for a lot of people is very different. And I think that getting people on board to an epistemology that emphasizes above all else, empirical evidence and coherency and logic is extremely important.
Right. Yeah, this is why me and Mitch kind of were like, the first thing we were concerned about was rational. That because that's how you build a rational epistemology. If you don't have that rational epistemology, if you have a epistemology that's not based on logic and reason, then anything can go. Basically, free will can go. Anything. So.
Yeah, and I would have to say that if there was, say, the happiness pill or the pill of friendship or whatever that made everybody compassionate, caring, and nice, in such a hypothetical situation, maybe rationality wouldn't be so important. But because we don't have those things, rationality at this time is the most important thing because it's the only way to prevent suffering and achieve happiness.
I like money.
Are you
That's
guys?
a
Yeah,
good point.
How do you
That's a
guys?
good point. If Chandler could just pay everybody to believe in, to not believe in free will, then we wouldn't have a problem here, Chandler. So get on that and start mailing out money to people.
Oh, yeah. Oh man, this is crazy. Yeah, but David and Jamie, you've probably been listening. What's your take so far?
well, I was obviously just joking about the money thing, but I think you guys have pretty much nailed it. So I've really got nothing to add.
Same here.
Well, it's very important. One thing, yeah, we've been going for about 54 minutes, and I just wanted to mention that this free will topic is perhaps like the biggest philosophical and political debate really that's ever happened, and why we do this podcast. But not just for society as a whole, but also for the individual. For the individual who is struggling with self-blame, for example, and blaming themselves and being depressed over something, losing the free will belief helps them not blame themselves, and it also helps reduce their anger towards other people, which leads them away from violence. And so I think that it does help people individually in a way that they can immediately experience. Because sure, we haven't seen the society-wide experience. We haven't seen all the military shut down, through everyone being, determinists and nobody blaming everybody. But it has brought us together, hasn't it, guys?
Yeah, and Chandler, again, this is like this. It's more than just a quote unquote philosophical, logical question or debate. This is about sanity. This is about it's completely delusional for an individual or a civilization to believe in free will. I mean, like somebody could believe that they're Napoleon, and yeah, all right, maybe they're a reincarnation. That's a possibility, but there's absolutely no possibility in free will. It is like, in other words, our world is completely insane, completely delusional, insane, and that's major.
Yeah, I really think it is a sanity question because it's like I would rather have the world be run by people who perhaps they might be, yeah, they might believe in reincarnation or something like that. But as long as they don't have a free will belief, that makes them crazy in their policies and believing that people fundamentally deserve to be tortured, they would still be better than the leaders that we've got now.
Amen.
Yeah, I think we all agree there that it definitely affects how we treat people. I believe that the empirical evidence that we need is right here with us right this moment, because we know that we have become less judgmental. We've become less hateful of people and of ourselves when we understand that even though we've done things that are undesirable, we understand that we are not the source of evil. We are not the self-chosen monsters or anything like that. And that's a good feeling, I think.
All right, so one of the challenges is like, people are going to like, I think, they have a difficulty with, accepting they don't have a free will. They have an even greater difficulty with accepting that there's no God. So like, perhaps eventually the whole concept of God will be done away with. But until then, one of our major challenges is like, like you're saying, like if the evil we do is not up to us, it's a logical conclusion in the minds and within the paradigms of most religious people. Well, that means that God is evil. And so like the only way that I've thought of to kind of like, circumvent that is by that infinite regress, that if we can never reach a point at which God made a decision to do something evil, then God can't be evil either. But then that's not completely satisfactory, because then God can't be good either. So can you see that our problem? In other words, like, for a lot of religious people especially, our not having free will in their mind means that like, well, God is evil.
What's interesting about this, George, is that you have to be a practical theologian or something like that in order to get into that discussion, don't you?
Well, again, like I'm talking from a very practical messaging perspective. If 80-90% of people here in the United States believe in God or a higher power, and we're trying to deliver our message about free will, we have to, address their concerns from their perspective. We have to kind of like understand why it's so difficult for them to accept what we're saying, regardless of the logic and the evidence and the reasoning.
Yeah, you're right, George. Our audience is important because even though, our co-hosts, we don't have the problem of discussing the whole God question that much. But for our listeners, this will be an issue, and it's important that we take their beliefs into account, because that will affect how they receive our message, and we don't want them to misunderstand.
Yeah, the problem is, as soon as free will gets thrown out, so does a lot of people's God concept. So they have an idea that God gave Adam and Eve free will. Adam, by his free will, ate the apple, and that's where all sin came in. All this this stuff that they have in their minds is embedded. So the problem with showing them that they have no free will is that it takes away their actual notion of God. So that and if they have a hard time getting rid of that, then they're going to also have a hard time getting rid of their free will belief. So
Free will, or get undermining someone's free will, however you do it, also will probably in most cases have the side effect of undermining their belief in God at the same time.
exactly.
Yeah, this is very interesting, guys, and I definitely think that's something that we need to keep in mind for our future episodes. We've talked about many important issues in this podcast, and we've passed an hour. So, do you think we should wrap it up?
Sounds
Yeah.
good.
Okay, well, you've been listening to the 100th episode of.
Yeah, 100.
Yeah! Excellent. You've been listening to the 100th episode of the Free Will, Science, and Religion podcast, and the 7 co-hosts who happen to be on this episode have been talking about every type of subject, and I hope you aren't too confused. And we raised some interesting questions related to the God subject, the happiness subject, and the intellectual honesty subject, basically. So this will give us ideas of future topics to explore in future episodes. So Thank you for listening and look forward to more episodes. Bye.